Hi, Jess. We'll just wait for the others to join us and we'll kick off in a moment. And people joining the sessions tab, they'll see us waiting for everyone to join us. Hello, Asmita.
I'm here, and I don't know why it looks green.
Just waiting for. We're due to kick off in a minute. Jess, we're a minute away from kicking off. Do we have Sarah yet? So if you can get Vet to facilitate Sarah joining, and we'll kick off in a minute anyway, because we'll start with you and then we'll come across to Asmita and then we'll go to Sarah. We have people joining. I just see it's coming up. Asmita, you're sharing your multiple screens at the moment, so
it's not clear what to share. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep, I can hear you, and we're about to kick off.
Okay.
I'll give it another 30 seconds for people joining. I see we've got 33 joining, more joining as we speak. We'll start shortly. Jess, we still have about 40 people that are sitting on the main stage tab, needing to come over to the session tab. Right, I'll kick off for those who are joining us for this session on Tip of the Iceberg. I'd like to welcome you all, and I'd like to first pay thanks to Julia Gillard for that really good keynote that she gave at the start, setting the context of not only the problem of sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid sector, but drawing the lessons from the child abuse inquiry in Australia and the response to that, and how the response in Australia can feed into the discussion we need to have on solutions for sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid industry. So thank you, Julia. Now, sexual exploitation and abuse by aid workers has been acknowledged by the United Nations since at least the mid-1990s. Indeed, that's when I first became aware of it working for the International Committee for the Red Cross in former Yugoslavia, when we saw the scandal that later became known as the whistleblower scandal, since turned into a movie starring Rachel Weisz. And for those who would like to understand the scale and how long people have known about sexual abuse in the aid industry, I strongly urge people to movie. But it wasn't until 2017, some 20 odd years later, that the United Nations Secretary General finally acknowledged that the problem is bigger amongst civilian contingent than it is amongst military peacekeepers. NGO and media investigations, including the 2002 UN High Commission for Refugees and Save the Children report, have consistently raised the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse. However, the majority of academic literature has until recently failed to deal systematically with the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse by civilian aid workers. A recent book by Jasmine Kim-Westendorf at La Trobe University in Australia has shone the light not just on the peacekeeper abuse, but also the civilian abuse. The International Development Select Committee's report in the House of Commons in 2018 highlighted that what we know may be just the very tip of the iceberg. And the 2021 follow-on report found that despite improvements in hiring practices and training, sexual exploitation and abuse by the aid industry is still prevalent. This session for the next hour will explore what we know about the nature and scale of sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid industry. It will also present the findings of our King's College literature review on the subject. Key questions that we will explore in this session and will seek to answer or partially answer are: what do we know about the scale and nature of sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid industry? Why does it remain underreported? Have efforts to tackle the problem been sufficient? And if not, why not? And for those that haven't moved across from the stage tab, this is taking place. After this, we will have follow-on sessions here. So allow me to introduce the three speakers that we have in this session this morning. Firstly, I'm going to be joined by Asmita Naik. Asmita is an international and development and human rights consultant. She is also a part-time adjudicator on various regulatory bodies in the health and media sectors and a magistrate in the criminal courts. Asmita has been a long-standing advocate for victims and survivors of sexual exploitation and abuse by aid workers. She co-authored a report in 2002 on the sexual exploitation of children by aid workers and peacekeepers in West Africa, and this led to global policy on the issue for the first time. I'd also like to welcome Sarah Champion MP. Sarah is the Member of Parliament for Rotherham and Chair of the UK Parliament's House of Commons International Development Select Committee. This committee scrutinises the spending, administration and policies of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in regard to UK aid, and has recently undertaken an inquiry into sexual abuse in the aid sector. Sarah has campaigned extensively on issues such as child sexual exploitation, modern slavery, smart motorways, equal pay and domestic abuse. She has a particular interest in the rights of women and children. And finally, we're joined by Jessica Toale. Jessica is a political and international development specialist with more than 10 years' experience working with parliamentarians, NGOs, businesses and UN agencies on a range of complex policy. She is the Research Associate for the Intersect Action Unit at King's College London, delivering a literature review on the scale and underreported nature of sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid industry. So I'd like to welcome Jessica, Asmita and Sarah. And can I first turn to you, Jessica? What are the findings of your report and what are your feelings on sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid industry and its underreported nature?
Thank you, Andrew. I'm just going to share my screen because I have some slides to share with everyone this morning, which outline some of the findings from this report. So bear with me for just a moment while I get that up. Thanks. And of course, it doesn't appear to be working this morning.
Technology always proves to have a little hiccup when we need it to.
Exactly.
Cross, you can grab it, but I have eminent faith, Jessica, in your ability to speak to the topic.
Okay.
Jessica's just bringing her screen up. I'd like to remind all the participants and viewers of this. On the right-hand side, you have a Q&A tab in which you can put questions to the panelists that I'll ask them later, and you can even make comments in a chat screen if you wish. So feel free to put your question and answers in the Q&A tab and any comments in the chat screen. Jessica, over to you.
Right, I'm going to try this instead.
If it's not working, Jess, I'll ask you to speak to the contents without the slide, if you like.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to do that because it doesn't appear to be working. Sorry about that, everybody, but hopefully what I'm about to say will give you a great overview of the headline findings of the review that I undertook about the scale and nature of sexual abuse and exploitation in the aid industry. Now, as Andrew said, this topic isn't new. Reports can be traced back to the early 90s. And there has been much study into the phenomenon, and particularly in relation to military peacekeepers. But what we have done, which is slightly different, is focus solely on sexual exploitation and abuse by civilian aid workers. The data and findings I'll present below come from UN data, reports, from academic literature, and from grey literature, including government reports, media reports, and NGO reports. And what's striking about this is much of what we know about sexual exploitation and abuse by aid workers is drawn from media and NGO reports, and there's quite strikingly little academic literature looking at this specific subset. So why have we decided to focus on this? The 2018 Oxfam sex scandal in Haiti was significant because it really punctured the notion that sexual exploitation was more prevalent amongst military peacekeepers. And it brought the subject to widespread attention. It unleashed a wave of new policies, safeguarding guidelines, practices, and prompted a UK parliamentary inquiry that concluded that the sector's historic response had been complacent, bordering on complicit. So better understanding of the problem is really needed to inform future policy responses. Now, as Andrew mentioned, the UN has acknowledged the problem since the early 90s. In 2011, the UN Secretary General noted that per capita, the problem was greater amongst civilian peacekeepers. And in 2017, Guterres admitted that it was a problem of the entire institution. This assertion is supported by some of the figures that I have found through trawling through multiple bits of data from the UN. And when looking at a breakdown of allegations amongst military peacekeepers, civilian peacekeepers, staff, related personnel, and implementing partners, it's clear that in the past few years, allegations against implementing partners and UN-related staff are far, far greater than those against military peacekeepers. But this data only offers a partial picture. We know very little about the true scale of abuse by civilian aid workers. There's no systematic data on its prevalence. What we do know is that there is a substantial gap between the findings of NGO media reports and these official statistics. The problem is often described as widespread, endemic, pervasive, systematic. Yet, as Julia said in her opening speech, between 2003 and 2020, there were just 2,031 allegations against civilian peacekeepers and aid workers recorded by the UN. These official statistics are accepted to be extremely low and mask extremely significant levels of underreporting. Now, while all forms of sexual exploitation and abuse have been recorded, perpetrated by aid workers, sexual exploitation is more prevalent than sexual abuse. And this most often takes the form of exchanging food for sex for food, basic items, including sanitary pads, tarpaulins for shelter, or employment opportunities. There are significant gaps, however, as 30% of the data we have from the UN are allegations in which the type of abuse or exploitation is other or unknown. Figures also mask significant blurring between sexual exploitation and abuse, where NGO reports have described exploitation leading to abuse, where promises are unfulfilled, or where rape is disguised as prostitution. These figures also don't take into account the significant discussion around women's consent. Because consensual relationships are strongly discouraged, they're often recorded as sexual exploitation. It won't be a surprise to any of you on the line that women and girls are most vulnerable to sexual exploitation and abuse, particularly where these vulnerabilities intersect. So we're talking about orphans, child-headed households, and a number of folks focused particularly on Syria and Lebanon talk about the impact of SEA on divorcees and widows. Women account for 80% of victims, whereas men account for 6%. The rest, the gender is unknown. Adults were also most frequently cited as victims in UN data. However, what's notable is that when the data relates to implementing partners, those consultants, NGO implementing partners, more often the victims are cited as children. And this is corroborated by what we see in a lot of NGO reports about SEA on the ground. Sexual exploitation and abuse is fundamentally about an abuse of power that feeds off poverty, extreme deprivation, and the fragility in humanitarian development settings that undermines the usual social norms and institutional protections afforded to women. So it'll be no surprise to you that the majority of perpetrators are recorded as men in positions of power. These could be anything from senior managers in international organizations to the drivers, guards, and local contractors drawn from the local community. These are people who have access to resources and humanitarian commodities that people need. Nationally employed staff are cited as the most common perpetrators in UN data. In fact, it amounts to about 60% of the recorded allegations. And this is largely because these people make up the vast majority of staff on the ground, and they're often given unprecedented levels of power over their fellow refugees or community members, and are often operating in unsupervised environments. So why don't we know about the true nature and scale of sexual exploitation? Three main things. One, there's no standard way to collect data. There are different tracking, reporting, assessment systems, as well as regular changes to the categories. In a lot of the data I've cited, I've had to exclude UN Secretary General report data because it changes so often. The categories change so often, often annually. And UN data isn't compatible with the data generated by qualitative studies undertaken by NGOs. So there's a bit of a gap between the two. Secondly, there's chronic underreporting by victims and the community. Sexual violence in any circumstances is an underreported crime, and this is exacerbated by post-conflict and humanitarian settings. Few report sexual violence due to resignation or acceptance of the behavior because of lack of awareness of policies or reporting mechanisms, a lack of faith in these mechanisms, or because of fear of reprisals, economic loss, or stigma within their community. But perhaps the most egregious reason is failure to disclose or cover up by officials themselves. Historically, investigations into allegations have been really poor, with delays, evidence being lost, witnesses being intimidated, or the confidentiality of witnesses being compromised. And the UN assessment stage often filters significant amounts of allegations so that they're never officially recorded. Organizations have frequently been accused of caring more about the protection of their reputations than the people they're there to support. The few attempts that there have been to overcome some of these challenges, one of the slides I was going to show you had three examples, one in Liberia, one in Haiti, and the Hear Their Cries global attempt to estimate the scale. The former two rely very much on extrapolating from a small sample and still only offer a partial picture because they're geographically bound. Hear Their Cries estimates relate on the assumption that the number of civilian cases is higher than military cases, and on an estimate of historic underreporting of sexual offences, which is higher in humanitarian and development context. This estimate, I'm sure the authors might agree, has been criticised for lacking a rigour. It's an estimate, and they've called for a more academically defensible estimate in the future. But what is notable is that each of these studies find a huge gap between their estimates and what the official statistics record. So what does all this mean? I'm about to wrap up now. There's clearly a gap in the interest in tackling sexual exploitation and abuse by civilian aid workers and systematic academic efforts to understand the scale, nature, drivers, and impacts of this subset of sexual exploitation and abuse. This interest needs to be matched with the same rigor applied to understanding SEA by peacekeepers, not least because of the scale of humanitarian and development interventions and their reach around the world. I suggest in my paper that the sector can learn from other areas of research that deal with similar complex social and criminal contexts, like modern slavery or like attempts to estimate sexual violence more broadly. And And this type of sexual exploitation and abuse has significant consequences, not least for the victims and any children born to them. So further work really is needed to understand how to tackle it to achieve accountability, to deter future perpetration in the complex legal context that civilian aid workers operate in. And this work could really help policymakers develop more effective and objective tools to enhance accountability, support victims and prevent future abuses. And this should be alongside the many laudable efforts that are already being developed at present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And we will certainly, I'm sure, get lots of questions in the question and answer session, and have the other panelists question you on some of your data in a moment. But before we dig into yours a little bit further, I'd like to call on Asmita Naik. Asmita, as I said earlier, amongst other things, was the author of the 2002 report on sexual exploitation of refugee children by aid workers in West Africa. So, Asmita, can I pass over to you for some initial thoughts and reflections?
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm sorry that you can't see me, but I trust you can hear me. I'm having
we
some
can
kind
indeed.
of connecting. Great. So first of all, I'd really thank you for this opportunity to speak at this event, and to really commend King's for taking on this issue. You know, I've long lamented the lack of kind of academic attention to this issue, and particularly aid workers. Of course, there has been more on peacekeepers, as Jessica has said. So it's good to see this issue getting the attention it deserves. And certainly Jessica's paper really highlights the huge gaps in knowledge and uncertainty there is around this, the different typologies, definitions, terms, so on. But I think underlying all of that is the reason we know so little is that there simply aren't people who want us to know about this. You know, for a long time, raising this issue has relied on a small number of advocates and tiny advocacy groups, people like myself, Professor MacLeod, some others that will be speaking later today. And it's good that in recent years we now have people like Sarah, parliamentarians, ex-politicians, so on, coming forward to raise their voice. But the reason we don't know about this is not because it hasn't been happening for decades, but because nobody has wanted us to really know about this. You can, you know, just think on the fact that with other issues, there's always an NGO or lobby group. But in this case, there's a vested interest in not looking into this amongst the very type of groups that would normally be profiling human rights issues. I just want to make some observations on the characteristics of this problem that we should really bear in mind when we think about how to respond to it. First of all, it's been very difficult to highlight issues concerning aid workers in particular, as opposed to peacekeepers, because of all the kind of moral assumptions about doing good and so on. Certainly that was my experience back in 2002, when as part of a team we unexpectedly uncovered abuses. We went there to do something else, but nonetheless we documented allegations involving 67 aid workers with names, details of incidents. And then we documented allegations involving, generic allegations involving peacekeepers. And yet the UN's first response was to go and investigate the peacekeepers and not go and investigate the allegations about aid workers for 6 months. So from then, you know, I've always been very skeptical about, you know, the approach to this. And I actually do believe attention has been deliberately diverted to abuses about peacekeepers. Not that, you know, their abuses also don't deserve attention. The other factor is, I think, in this is different accountabilities. When we talk about aid workers, they are under the direct management control of UN agencies and NGOs, unlike peacekeepers where, you know, it goes back to governments and so on. So I would say this is an area where there is scope for greater control. Again, as Jessica has said, and it's good that her data supports this, is that a particular characteristic of this is that this is about sexual exploitation and transactional sex. And often it's about the abuse of aid resources. And we see that again and again. The new humanitarian reports recently about jobs for sex, the Oxfam Independent Commission report that again involved trading aid for sex, and of course the report I was involved in. And so again, this is something that goes to the heart of what organizations are responsible for. as Jessica pointed out, many of the aid workers implicated are local, and that's simply by virtue of the fact that most aid workers are local. And another assumption I want to challenge is about underreporting. I mean, my experience is that on the ground where this is happening, this is openly talked about. That was certainly the case in West Africa. It's certainly the case with the new humanitarian allegations that have come forward, you know, the Oxfam Independent Commission report and so on. So these are known about. So when we talk about underreporting, I think it's more about underaction and refusing to listen and turning a blind eye, because certainly on the ground, people do know, including staff, but for some reason, you know, this isn't rising further up to attention. So I highlight all of those factors because for me, that goes to the core of the problem that aid agencies need to grapple with and are responsible for. And what has concerned me somewhat in the response, particularly over the past couple of years, particularly in the national context here, not so much in multilateral settings, is that we shouldn't be swayed by stereotypes of Western paedophiles infiltrating aid agencies being the main part of this problem. Certainly it is a part of the problem, but I would say it's not the main part of the problem. I don't deny that Western abusers exist, of course they do, but often they tend to be opportunistic. They're not people with criminal records in the past or necessarily even predilections. They're there because they're in a lax environment and there's failure to exercise organizational controls. So once we've understood the characteristics of the problem, I think it's important then to devise a response that meets that need. And for me, it's very much about creating alternative systems of redress and justice. We're talking about contexts where law and order is broken down. So to try and institute criminal justice responses is simply not going to work. I do believe organizations are responsible for setting up complaints mechanisms, systems of independent redress. And this is what I have believed since 2003 from first-hand experience of understanding how difficult it is to raise these issues and to be heard. So I'll finish there. I think it's, you know, thank you for the opportunity, and it's excellent this debate is taking place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asmita, and I've certainly noted down a couple of questions when we get to the question and answer session as well. But before we do, I'd like to hand over to Sarah Champion, who, amongst other things, is currently chairing the International Development Committee of the House of Commons. And I know from personal experience and discussions, she is very passionate about wanting to protect women and children and wants to get aid to the bottom of the problem, but really push effective and long-term solutions. So, Sarah, can I pass over to you?
You can indeed. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today. This is a topic which we have to address without fear or favour. I want to sort of pull back to the bigger picture. I became the MP for Rotherham just over, well, coming up to 9 years now. And very quickly, it became apparent that there was wide-scale child abuse happening in that town. It happened because people turned a blind eye, and it happened because people found. When I came to chair the International Development Select Committee a year ago, I found a very similar culture within the aid organisation, and it shocked me. My opinion is that the culture of the sector is very much a colonial one. It's very much one of patronage. It's very much one that the people in the sector are really good people doing it for the right reasons. And because of that, the safeguardings that you would see in other projects haven't been embedded from the start, because the people that work in this sector are good people doing it for all the right reasons. So because of that, what we've allowed is a situation where people who are perpetrating the abuse are seen as good and above reprimand, and the people that are the recipients of the aid are seen as people who ought to be grateful. I put it bluntly. So what that's led to is an extreme power imbalance. And from all of my work around violence against women and girls, and particularly around sexual violence of children, when those extreme power balances exist, it's almost inevitable that abuse is able to flourish easily without any reprimand. And that's what I'm seeing within the aid sector. I think what we need to also challenge is, at the moment, the onus is on the victims to come forward and report. Indeed, they're criticised if they don't come forward and report. But unless you that culture that I've already described, think how is someone meant to know that it is wrong what's happening? So if you're a woman in a humanitarian crisis, you're desperate to get food for your children, and the person standing there who is able to give you that food says, well, okay, of course, you know, you can have the food, but this is what I want in exchange. Who wouldn't do that for their children? How would you know that that wasn't the rate of negotiation to get that food for your children? I've also heard across different humanitarian crises, there's almost a known exchange rate. If you want the aid, if you want a tarpaulin, then your child needs to be made available. If you want a job, then you are expected to sleep with the person who's able to give you that job. I mean, I'm really grateful for the Thomas Reuter's work and humanitarian work that exposed all of this most recently in the DRC. And what shocked me most was it was so normal that women were expected to have sex for jobs, women who were desperately needing that job, that even the translators were there negotiating the deal. The translator would be sat there with the UN official saying, oh yes, well, if you want this job, you need to sleep with John or whatever his name was. That UN vehicles, so the drivers of UN vehicles, would drive the perpetrator up to the hotel and wait outside. That's how obvious it was. The other thing that shocked me most, and I didn't really think about it, in the DRC, of the aid workers and peacekeepers that were there, 80% of them were men. Now, just think about the culture. Were we, and as the previous speakers have said, virtually all of the perpetrators are male, and the majority, they're not exclusively of the victims, are women and girls. Just think if we were able to get more of a 50-50 in the personnel that are out there, immediately that culture is starting to be challenged. Immediately the safeguards that you would expect would be put in place. That's what we need to see going forwards. The other thing which I found most shocking, and a number of people reported to our committee who were whistleblowers, was almost the contempt that whistleblowers are treated with within the sector. Now, I have a very different view. I have a view that a whistleblower is your canary. You know, they're there and they're shouting and they're telling you, hang on, we've got a problem here. You know, please take care, we've got a problem here. The fact that a whistleblower is coming to you, the organisation, rather than going to the media, you should see that as that is someone that is loyal to the organisation, that wants to make the positive change to protect the organisation, but to protect the work that the organisation is doing. Instead of whistleblowers being celebrated, what we see is they're quite often bullied, intimidated, belittled, sacked. They quite often have non-disclosure agreements put onto them as terms of their exit, and they're literally shut down. The organisation may well have fantastic policies in place, but a policy is useless if it doesn't work in practice. The other big thing that we need to see much more of is transparency from the organisations, and we need people reporting sexual abuse is not a bad thing. That's a good thing. You know, that's something that the organisation should expect to be happening in a crisis situation, in a war situation, where there is that extreme acknowledged power imbalance. But that's the problem, because we don't acknowledge that extreme power imbalance. We don't then see the abuse as inevitability, and therefore we don't build in the safeguarding and the reporting mechanisms into all of the projects. So I feel really conflicted over organisations like Oxfam. Don't get me wrong, what Oxfam did in Haiti, what it's turned a blind eye to in other parts of the world, is despicable. But Oxfam has tried to address and implement changes, but it's still getting vilified for it. Whenever we talk about abuse in the aid sector, we still talk about Oxfam. For me, Oxfam is at least trying to change. The ones that worry me more are the organisations that go, no, there's no problem here. You look away, or look to Oxfam. They've got a problem. Don't look to us. Of course, there is the potential for a problem in your organisation. So I want organisations to feel emboldened to say, okay, yeah, we found this issue, this is how we've dealt with it. And you know, the best way of dealing with this, the best way of dealing with it is empowering the people on the ground who are the aid recipients. They're the people that know what the issues are, and they're the people that know what the solutions are. And by giving them the power, the authority, and most importantly, the cash, they can prevent this abuse from happening. And they can also, most crucially, help with putting the support services around those victims so that they are able to rebuild their life when this horror happens to them. Thank you.
Very much, Sarah. Your passion and strong belief in this clearly comes through. And now I'm probably going to ask a couple of nasty questions of each of the panelists, because a couple of things have come through in these presentations. Jess, you said that whilst this has been known, it's been under-researched for years because the institutions have chosen not to know. Asmita, you said it's more a question of under-action, not under-reporting. It's known in the field and people are turning a wanted blind eye. And Sarah, you said it's normal for women to expect to have sex to get the jobs or to get the aid, and that translators were even negotiating the deal. So I'm going to ask a difficult question, and I don't want to in any way put a moral equivalence between the institution and individual perpetrators or downgrade the crime of individual perpetrators. But if you could only respond to one side, fix individual perpetrators or fix the way institutions deal with this, which is the bigger problem? The individual perpetrators or the institutions? Sarah, I might go to you first, Asmita second, and Jessica third on that one. Sarah, over to you.
There's no debate on this. It's the cultural, the culture of the organisations that allows the abuse to flourish. There are always bad people, but what we can do is we can put safeguards and protections around them. And what our inquiry showed is that the vetting process isn't strong enough. The safeguarding process isn't inbuilt from the start. The response from the organisation is nowhere near robust enough. And then the so-called reporting mechanisms are just not effective. And then the final stage is when, if throughout all of those blocks that are put in place, a victim is able to be heard, listened to and responded to, the response is never adequate. So unless you tackle the culture within the aid sector as a whole and organisations specifically, focusing on individual perpetrators, whilst it makes us feel better because they're a baddie, will make absolutely no difference whatsoever.
Can I read into that, Sarah, just looking at a question that Will Worley has put up on the Q&A section here, said, are the speakers referring to UN agencies, NGOs or both? I assume from that you're meaning the entire sector, UN agencies, NGOs, etc.
Absolutely, across the board. And the way I view it is from a health and safety point of view. You know you're working in a risky environment, therefore you have a duty to put the safeguards in place to prevent the accidents from happening. That's the mindset the aid organisations need to get into.
Asmita, over to you for the question of which is, I don't want to say worse, but which is the bigger problem, the institutional failings or the individual perpetrators?
No, absolutely. I'm totally with Sarah. It's the institutional failings across the sector that are the problem. Here we're not talking about isolated cases of abuse. Unfortunately, human nature being what it is, and the deep-rooted causes of sexual violence mean that there will probably always be isolated cases. But what's troubling here is the systematic abuse we repeatedly see. I mean, look at the recent new humanitarian allegations. We're talking about multiple perpetrators, multiple agencies, multiple victims. Now, there is no way that can be going on without many people knowing about it. So for me, it's not about individuals. And if I was a cynic, I would say the way the aid sector has responded to this over the years, and I've seen it again since 2018, is to always make out that there are a few bad apples out there and actually turn it into an issue about individual perpetrators and deflect attention away from organisations. And unfortunately, that's what I've also seen in the policy response. Hence, we get lots of initiatives about creating registers and doing this and that, instead of actually giving people their rights and their voice and their ability to raise concerns. So totally. I think this is about organisations and organisations then holding individuals to account, but it has to come in that order.
Jessica, in the work you've done in the literature review, did it come over more that, as Asmita said, people are trying to blame the bad apples, or do the organisations and literature tend to reflect an understanding of the systematic problems that Sarah's been very passionate about?
Yes, at the risk of sounding boring, I agree with both Sarah and Asmita on this point, that the literature very much says that this is a systematic problem and not related to just a few bad apples. One of the things that I mentioned in my presentation was that one of the most egregious reasons this continues to happen is active cover-up and reputational protection issues. I think there has been a lot of really good work in the past few years to try to overturn this, but there's still a fear that reporting more cases of sexual abuse will cause more harm to the aid industry than not reporting them, if you see what I mean. And victims are reported as having a really significant concern that their allegations or their complaints won't be taken seriously because of how bad the system has been at responding to those. One other thing I think is relevant to this is that sexual exploitation and abuse historically has been treated as a sort of individual misconduct issue. And I think that's where one of the big problems is. It hasn't been treated as a criminal or an institutional issue. And that's something where we're seeing movement in the right direction, but not quite enough speed. What's interesting is that historically the focus on peacekeepers has in part been because of the idea that it's easier to deal with because of military command structures, because peacekeepers tend to wear their uniforms when they're out and about, whereas civilian aid workers are much of people working with a lot of different organizations. But actually, we've heard today that there are absolutely the structures that can be utilized to tackle this problem at a systematic level at the UN and with NGOs. And I think that's where the focus in the future should be.
During Sarah's presentation, she made the point quite accurately, in my view, that the vast majority of perpetrators are male. And certainly my experience in that locker room talk, for the want of a better phrase, that you had between men in the aid industry, that didn't surprise me at all. And when I left the aid industry, citing the sexual abuse as one of the reasons for leaving, I continued to lobby for this over the last 10 or 11 years. And I had a number of people who are still in the aid industry that I counted or count as friends have contacted me over the last couple of years saying, Andrew, your work is threatening our funding. Sarah, as a funder, the British Parliament, what is your view of people who say us raising the awareness and trying to prevent sexual abuse is threatening funding in the aid industry, particularly, as you said during your report, we need the reporting of abuse to be seen as a good thing. And in the first International Development Committee report, it said that people are putting the reputation of the agencies before the protection of the children, partly because there is a fear of funding being cut. How do we square in people perceiving honesty equals cut to funding?
You're absolutely right. The sector is very scared. They do look at what happened to an organisation like Oxfam, who was unable to bid for taxpayers' money. And I think that's what we need to remember. UK government money is taxpayers' money. And I think we have an absolute duty to make sure that it is spent in the most appropriate way. So I think the government needs to be more robust about demanding transparency, putting the data front and foremost. It needs to be more robust in having whistleblower policies, but also to know that any allegations, either by whistleblowers or by victims, is going to the board. The reason I say that is the Charity Commission has great reach and powers, but only over the board. So we need to see that that information goes up the chain. And board members need to be asking, if they're not getting any cases reported to them, then that's probably symptomatic of a problem lower down in the organisation. So it's about in its broadest sense, risk management and also PR management. So the organisations, and that's what I mean about shifting the culture, we need to be more upfront that this is a very, very risky environment that we're working in, and that things will go horribly wrong. But when they go horribly wrong, swift action is taken. That's the only way to do it. And the problem we've got is, at the moment, while a lot of organisations sit, we're not getting that one voice saying, I'm really sorry about this, but in a humanitarian crisis, bad things happen, but we're doing everything we can to address it. I mean, I think the closest example should be the Catholic Church. It denied and it denied and it denied. And what that did was it undermined its reputation to a very, very deep extent. Whereas when it came forward from the top down and said, right, this is outrageous, we're going to address this through every aspect of our work, the population, the public went, oh, okay, you know, we get that. There's going to be some bad apples, but we get that you're trying to make a difference. And I think that's what aid organisations need to do now. They need to be upfront about this.
Can I ask another question coming from the chat screen? I'm going to bring some things up from the chat screen, but also from the Q&A screen as well. There's a little bit of dialogue going on between a couple of the people on the chat screen about whether transactional sex is or is not abusive. Asmita, can I throw that to you for your feeling? Is transactional sex abuse, or is that a consensual action?
Gosh, that's a big question, and I'm not following the detail on the chat, but certainly I'm talking in this context that we're talking about when it comes to, some of the most impoverished people and vulnerable people in the world, and we're talking about transacting basic supplies for sex. That is clearly a huge abuse of power. There's no doubt in my mind about that. I'm not going to get into the broader questions about, whether the legitimacy of prostitution in a society like this or not. I mean, these are bigger questions, but, the type of the abuse we're talking about, yes, it is clearly absolutely a violation of the rights of these individuals.
Sarah, you had your hand up just as Asmita started to answer. Your view?
So to come clean, I'm an abolitionist when it comes to prostitution. But what I would say is, if the two parties were of equal status, if they're and both were acting under their own agency, then I think you could argue that it is acceptable. However, in all of the situations we're talking about, there is an inherent power imbalance. And therefore, I do not think that it is acceptable at any level. And one of the things I was really pleased that DFID did was it made any transactional sex of any member of its staff a disciplinary, well, I think it was actually a gross misconduct issue. And we pushed, and we have now made that happen across the whole of FCDO. The step that we haven't got them to commit yet is I personally think that if you are in receipt of FCDO money, then it is gross misconduct for transactional sex if you're one of the local agencies that's delivering the projects. We haven't got that yet, but we're still pushing for that.
Okay, the next question I'm going to pull from the Q&A screen, and Jessica, I'll be throwing to you for this one. Two questions have come from someone listed as anonymous, or two people listed as anonymous for obvious reasons. I don't know if it's the same person asking. One is, for students of humanitarian action interested in conducting research on this issue, how do you suggest we collect data on such a sensitive topic? And following on from that question, if the problem has not been researched, how would you tell us its characteristics? i.e., how would you tell that the perpetrators are not Western without data to back this up? Jess, over to you.
Well, on the first part, I think there are some lessons that we can learn from areas of quantitative criminology that have tried to deal with a lot of similar face in the aid industry. Modern slavery was one of the ones I mentioned, and there have been some studies in the DRC in particular on the DRC on the levels of sexual violence, and they use sort of mixed methods to attempt to use the data that they have to extrapolate up to a global estimate or a wider estimate. I think it is a big challenge though, because you make quite a lot of assumptions, and finding out or making sure that you have evidence-backed assumptions is quite a challenge. On the second question, I think what we do know, and what I did say about my research, is that what I'm saying is all a partial picture. We have anecdotal evidence from NGO and media reports, which are very compelling, and we also have more qualitative data from the allegations made by and reported by the UN, which provide a picture of what we know. And so my saying that 60% of allegations are against local staff or contractors is based on what we have. It's not a full picture, which is why I think there does need to be a bit more systematic research into the topic.
Asmita, you've talked about this for some time as well. What is your view on the issue about what we do know and what's come out of anecdotal evidence and what's come out of academically rigorous evidence?
I don't think I can, add too much more to what Jessica has said on that. So I'll defer to what she said. But I did actually want to respond to the earlier question about the backlash, because I think, that, a lot of questions can be asked of that assumption. Firstly, I do want to draw attention to the fact that even in 2018, at the height of these scandals, certainly some of the research I saw showed that organisations didn't lose funding, apart from Oxfam, and it didn't actually lose funding. It was prohibited from applying from DFID funding. So surely, there should be a competitive market between NGOs. And if that funding from Oxfam was distributed elsewhere, I would say that's, a good thing. And in the meantime, I believe Oxfam also got a huge windfall that year. So, I mean, I don't buy the argument that organisations are losing money, or, this is not about saving individual organisations. And for me, if organisations want to avoid any kind of media scandal, which happens very rarely, let's face it, the global media is not interested in this issue and very rarely reports it. They need to put their data up front. I mean, if they report these cases, there's no story. The story comes from the cover-up. This is what makes a story run. It isn't the fact. The UN in recent years has got a much more transparent approach of publishing its data. I would be surprised that there are any media stories arising from the data that it publishes. The stories come from cover-ups, and this is what the aid sector should learn.
Asmita, that's a very good lead into the next session, which will be specifically looking at why this story hasn't got traction. We've got a couple of journalists who will be speaking to that point, but we've got about 4 or 5 minutes to go before this session. I'd want to pull back to the Q&A screen again to, and forgive me, Pamela, if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Pamela Reese has asked, Ms. Toale, seeing as you have researched cases of sexual exploitation abuse by civilians, do you have any information if Bourget, the French guy, remains the only civilian peacekeeper to have been jailed for sexual exploitation and abuse? Before throwing to you, Jessica, I will point out that I know of at least Peter Dalglish, who was not a peacekeeper and was involved in civilian aid, was finally caught by the Nepalese authorities and jailed by Nepal, but that's after he left the international NGOs. Jess, what are your comments about people who have been charged, prosecuted and jailed?
Thanks, Andrew. I saw that in the chat, and actually it's not really been, it wasn't within the purview of my research to look at the outcome of investigations into sexual exploitation and abuse. I was using allegations as a proxy, but because that's the best number that we have at the moment. What I do know is that the amount of allegations that are substantiated is extremely low. And the view isn't because that there are a ton of false allegations made. The view is that this is because it's very, very difficult to gather data, particularly in humanitarian and post-conflict areas. And as I mentioned during my presentation, Often evidence is covered up. Significant delays in investigation means that there is just no way of collecting. As in other cases of sexual violence, it comes down to a he says, she says, and the investigation process is just so poor that it often doesn't lead to substantiation nor even getting anywhere near a criminal process. So that is one of the things sort of down the line that we need to be able to develop a bit better to ensure that proper justice is coming through for victims.
Sarah, you've got your hand up, and I'll ask you to keep concise because I want to ask one more question of each of the panelists, and we've only got 2 or 3 minutes left.
But this might be my answer to a question. I'm a politician. I knock a lot of doors in Rotherham and I speak to a lot of people. And the scale of abuse in Rotherham came to the fore in August 2014, and there was a general election in 2015. Now, when I was knocking on doors, I would say 1 in 20 of the people that I spoke to knew all about the abuse and they knew who the perpetrator was. We now have a national crime agency investigation, and every name I've been given is correct, and they're now being prosecuted. So for me, getting the information is not hard. You just go and you ask the people and they'll tell you. They know. What they don't have is any way of reporting that. And what happens is no one wants to listen when they do tell them, so they just stop trying. And that's what we have to break down.
Now that feeds very well, Sarah, into a session we've got later on in the day that I'll be presenting. I'm just having a quick look at 2:30. For those who are watching, I'll be leading a discussion on the creation of an international body to seek out and find victims and prosecute offenders. So not just waiting for victims to come forward, but actually proactively going out. But there's a lot of complexity in that we will be touching at the session at 2:30. I'd like to ask one last question of each of you and try and keep it to 10 or 15 seconds, but you're going to kill me when you hear the question because it's quite a complex one. Asmita, you said the story is the cover-up. Jessica, you've pointed out that people have known and have turned a blind eye. Sarah, you've said in the current IDC report and the earlier IDC report said that agencies put the protection of themselves before the protection of the children, principally because they're worried about losing funds. How do we change that dynamic and make it a reward, maybe even a financial reward, for people who come forward with large numbers on abuse? Sarah, to you first, then Asmita, and then Jess. And keep it really tight if we can, because we're just in our last minute.
I think that part of the donor's requirement is to see the details of all allegations that come forward and the response to them. And unless organisations provide that, they shouldn't get the funds in the first place.
Asmita, over to you.
Absolutely, I agree. I think it ultimately comes down to the donors. I mean, they're custodians of public money, and they need to exercise that oversight and reward organisations that do better. I mean, what I find troubling is that we see donors constantly trying to rehabilitate organisations that have failed instead of trying to distribute this money to those that are doing better and trying their best. As we say, this is about systemic abuses. It's not about an isolated case here or there. So I think it's down to the donors, and then it's down to democratic institutions such as, the IDC and so on, to then hold donors to account. Thank you.
And Jess, your final thoughts? Have we lost Jess?
No, I'm back.
Hang on. Right.
I agree. And I think it's, given the attention with which this issue has garnered, not only is it about that funding, but it's about a proactive relationship of the donor with the organisations receiving their funding as well. So the UK government in many ways has done a good job in trying to wrangle the sector to be better, and to put the right things in place, to develop the right types of policies and processes. And I think that symbiotic relationship there is one of the best ways to try to make progress on the issue.
Thank you, Jess. Now that unfortunately brings us to the end of this session, because you can tell we could continue to talk about this, need to continue to talk about this significantly. So everyone virtually join me in a round of applause. Sarah Champion, the the MP for Rotherhithe and the chair of the International Development Committee of the House of Commons. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for all the work I know you're doing in the background as well. Asmita, thank you very much for coming along today, and from our discussions in various parts of the world, I know how passionate you've been on this, and thank you for your hard work. And Jess, the research you've done is excellent. I'm looking forward to the ongoing work that you're doing and working with you. For everyone who's watching, we roll straight over into another session. Why hasn't the issue gained traction, which is feeding nicely from this one, as we hear from Margaret Simons, an international award-winning freelance journalist and author, Rowena Meyer, a multimedia journalist and researcher, and Lizzie Roberts, the news reporter at the Daily Telegraph and Sunday Telegraph, on the issue of, if this has been so well known, and if Me Too has got traction, and if Time's Up has got traction, why hasn't this? And let me put a juicy comment out once. A female journalist once said to me when I asked her why this isn't getting traction, and her response was, it's happening to little black girls in Africa and people don't care about little black girls in Africa. And as horrible as that sounds, there is some essence onto that. But what do the experts think? We will find that in the next session at 10:45, and at 11:15, we'll then all have a coffee break, and those of you who are in Melbourne, Australia, I'll make you a cup of coffee here. Otherwise, there's also a networking tab on the left, and you may choose to do some networking during the coffee break. But otherwise, again, I would like to thank Jessica, Asmita and Sarah, and I'd like to hand over to the 10:45 session about why this issue hasn't got traction. So thank you, everybody, and I look forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you.